Welcome back to the Not Your Mama podcast. This is your host, Kelly Bryant, creator and founder of Kelly Bryant Wellness. And I'm joined today by Joanna. I'm going to mispronounce your last name. I've never had to say it out loud. Osolnik?
Very close. Osolnik.
Osolnik. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us, Joanna.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here talking to you.
Okay, so start by telling us your pronouns and my favorite question, what emoji you most identify with.
My pronouns are she, her, hers. The emoji is a much harder question. If I'm just going based on the one I use the most, it's probably a thumbs up, which is kind of boring, but also at the same time, symbolic of my personality. So the thumbs up.
I think the most common answer has been the shrug emoji. And I'm like, I think that's just a life stage. That's just.
The face palm would be my other one.
Oh, yeah. I'm all about the face palm at this stage in life. So I love for these guest episodes with a parent, I would love for you to introduce all of the aspects of yourself that you want us to know about. So, the whole purpose of the show is to recognize the fact that even though, yes, we are parents, we are also lots of other things. So anything you want to tell us about your family, your job, your hobbies, take it away, Joanna.
All right. So we'll start with, since it's not your mama, I am mama to Cole, who is 3, and Daphne, who is 4.5 months. Wife to John Michael, who gave me this wonderful, unpronounceable last name. And when I am not at home with them, I am working in public health at the New York City Department of Health, which is a really fun and interesting place to be, especially in times like when we have coronavirus. And I don't know. I mean, it's almost hard to remember what hobbies are based on how the last year has been, because who has time for that stuff with everybody home
right.
all the time? But in my past life, well, you and I met because I used to be a yoga fanatic, and we met at Yoga Maya in Chelsea in New York City. Sometimes I read a book. My goal,
book all the way to the end.
Well, my goal in 2021 is to start reading whole books again, because I really only read articles. So
if you read whole articles, you're still doing better than me, because I only read the first half of books.
You never read the end of a book?
This is like about to be a psychology set. Are you ready for therapy?
I'm reading a book about therapy right now.
It's a nonfiction thing. So when I start a nonfiction book, I read it, like, it's interesting, and I read enough to like get the gist. And I wish I could remember who said it, but somebody was like, nonfiction books could almost always be an article, but publishers can't sell an article for $9.99 in paperback.
True.
So they just repeat the same thing over and over and over again and give more case studies. And I'm like, I wish, like, I'm sure the back half of the book probably has valuable takeaways, but like once it gets repetitive, I'm out.
I mean, fair enough. Fair enough. If it's repeating and you've reached like a threshold point for yourself, be done. You've got other stuff to do.
And then of course this is all like extra ironic, because I'm pretty sure I've talked to you guys about neurosculpting, but like I also have a thought that I am not someone who ever finishes books. Which is interesting.
You just believe that about yourself.
Yes, exactly. And then of course it becomes true, because I think that I'm never going to finish a book.
Well, that might be an interesting goal.
Yeah. So the last book that I read all the way to the end was probably an audio book. No, you know what? I read the last nonfiction book I did read, Brene Brown's, I forget which book, but the vulnerability one.
I think I'm the only person who has not gotten into Brene Brown. So like, I know who she is, but I've not really read any of her stuff.
I was new to her. And at the beginning of COVID, she had her podcast, like she released a podcast, and I listened to an episode or two and I was like, okay, I feel like I did not do the required reading before the class started. And I need to like go back. And it is interesting. Like if you know, I don't think I knew that she was like a researcher. So she presents a lot of data, which I was not expecting.
Yeah.
I I was expecting more like self-help woo-woo. And it is a
That's
little
what I
bit,
thought it was.
but it's very research backed and data driven, and she has a compelling voice.
Well, I'll add her to my list. I have a, you know, as the year, as 2020 ended and everyone was like, here's a summary of the things I did this year. I did jot down some book titles that crosses like, these were my favorite books.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll add Brene Brown to my ongoing list.
I'm going to pull it open right now and check which book I read, because it was Daring Greatly. I want to say it was Daring Greatly. I did not read it. I listened to it.
That's
Which
fine.
she's a you know, I like nonfiction when it's the like the author reading.
And she reads it.
Mm-hmm. And oh my God. Who is the comedian? He had a book about like love and relationships, but he reads it and he will do like, he'll say stuff where he's just like, there's a chart here, but you a-holes don't get to see it because you're lazy and you're listening to the audiobook.
I think I would like that version of it.
Mm-hmm.
I have no idea which comedian it is, though.
Oh my God, it's gonna make me crazy.
In like 30 minutes, it'll come to you.
It
or
will.
later today, and you can just text me when you remember.
He also has the show on Netflix that I can't remember the name of. I saw him at Madison Square Garden. Like, this is someone who I very much know who this person is, but also parent brain.
It's the worst.
So let's go ahead and get into it today. So I think actually I would love to start with the health department side of things, if you're cool with it, because I think you have what I am calling the COVID babies. You have a kid where you're like, the majority of your pregnancy happened during COVID.
Yeah.
Even though you were pregnant before that, what was it like, one, to be pregnant during COVID, and how did that shape in New York City? Worth noting. How did that shape your experience of pregnancy and prenatal care? And you also worked your freaking ass off. You worked so much, which for anyone who's listening who's like, why do you know that, Kelly? Joanna's just stuck with me forever because she did postpartum training, got pregnant, went straight into prenatal training, had the baby, went straight into postpartum training. So Joanna's just been with me continuously for like over a year now.
Yeah, we have officially reached over a year.
Yeah, when do you want to move in? I'll give you a key.
When the shed is done, I'll come.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about what that was like.
So oh my gosh, where should I start? Yeah, so I got pregnant before the pandemic was a pandemic here. It had obviously been going on in China beforehand. And I was finished with my first trimester when things really kicked into gear. And at work, for us, that means that you go from working your normal job to working in an emergency response role. And that varies. It can actually be very similar to what you do day to day, but it could also be very different. It depends on what's needed in the moment. So when we were all activated, that's the term that we use. my first activation role was something that I've done before. And because at the beginning here in New York, things were really crazy out there, but honestly, and we're not going to spend the whole time talking about all of the political BS, honestly, that's gone on in regards to this pandemic. But there was a lot that we couldn't do at the beginning, just due to politics, due to lack of information about what was really going on. So my first period of activation was the beginning of my second trimester. And during that time, I was sitting in a room with a person a foot to my right and a foot to my left, not socially distanced, not wearing masks, like no, that was before all of those guidelines were in place. I also happened to have a horrible cough that that lasted for 8 weeks. And turns out 2 coworkers who did have COVID during that time. So all that said, it still felt very removed. At that, I don't know if I ever actually had it or not, which is an aside, but certainly the experience of starting that and giving guidelines to people that we were not following ourselves was challenging. And to know that I was pregnant, but nobody around me knew, it felt like I was not ready to start telling people. And so I just kind of dealt with it. I hope other people might act differently, or somehow, feel like if they needed to protect themselves more, that they would advocate for themselves and do that. I did not do that in that moment. But I will also add that I think first baby versus second baby played a very big role in how I got through this pregnancy and managed to feel, pretty not stressed about the pregnancy itself.
Mm.
I knew what I was going to expect in my prenatal appointments. I knew, which ones I could do virtually and which ones I had to go into the office for. I was okay not having my partner in the appointments, all things that if I were doing this the first time around would feel really, really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And this time I just felt like this is not a big deal. I'm okay doing it by myself. So I think that, I have friends who had their first baby during this time, and lots of people had first babies. And for them, they struggled a lot with those things that, didn't end up being the biggest issues for me.
Right. And of course, that's going to vary. Like, there's 1,000 factors that play into that, right? Some people are not as comfortable with medical providers. So it could be their 17th baby and they
Right.
would not feel comfortable. Other people, presumably, I'm just assuming, like, if you were an OBGYN or an obstetric nurse, like, you would probably be like, I'm good. Like, first time you'd be like, no problem. I know what I'm doing here. This isn't an issue.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, it is, like, I appreciate you kind of like validating that, like, this wasn't a big deal for you and it might be for somebody else. I want to rewind for a sec, because one of the questions I try to ask all of the guests who are parents, why, like, I say this, and you have a toddler, so you'll probably relate to the question. The question is going to be, why have kids?
Oh.
And I don't mean it like that. What I mean is, having kids is so often just like a foregone conclusion for female identifying people in our society. And so I think it's worth asking the question of, like, why did you decide to have kids? What was your goal, with both the first pregnancy? Why'd you decide to have kids in the first place? Why'd you decide to have a second? Anything you want to share in that vein?
That's a really good question that, to be honest, I don't know if I've ever given specific thought to, in terms of why am I having this baby? At least the first time around. My husband and I, we never sat down and had a conversation that was like, I really want kids and I want to make sure that you're on the same page. It was, or at least I don't recall having like a super intense conversation like that.
Mm-hmm.
I knew he wanted kids. I knew I wanted kids. He jokes around. He wants our kids more than, just so that there's somebody to take care of him when he's older. But that is something that he does say to people a lot, as our families have gone through dealing with many family members getting older and not having any immediate family around them. And so we've stepped in where, children and siblings have not been available to these older family members. So that's something that's top of mind for him, but certainly not the only reason. don't
I
know,
always joke that it's because I'm amazing and the world needs more of my genes.
I wish that had been my first answer. I don't know. I mean, I'm the oldest. So I have a brother. I'm the older one. I'm the oldest of all of the kids in the families that we grew
Mm,
up with. And so I was always the one taking care of
mm.
everyone else. Um, I'm the oldest of my cousins. Um, I babysat a lot. I mean, there have just been kids in my life forever. Um, and it would seem, I mean, our days are very busy and they're not always, sometimes they're fun, sometimes they're not fun. But I can't imagine my life without my kids now. With Daphne, we were like, we did such a great job with Cole. He is awesome. Let's do it again.
That's great. I see we're over here like, this toddler's really intense. Maybe we'll just wait a little longer.
Yeah, I mean, he has his moments of intensity, but really he's such an easygoing kid. And,
Mm.
we didn't have terrible twos.
Oh my God, I hate you so much.
But trust me, I know I'm in for it.
On
Uh,
behalf of the listeners, I am so jealous.
I let me tell you, even in the 4.5 months we've had my daughter, she is very different than my
Mm,
son. And we actually had a conversation about that the other night where, we started sleep training because for us that's a choice that we made with Cole that we knew we wanted to do again with Daphne.
mhm,
And, we did. I was also the first of my friends to have a baby, so I had no real network of people to
mhm.
be like sharing experiences with and all that. Now everybody has a baby, but at the time it was just us.
now,
And
now everybody can get those Air Jordans, but
yeah.
when I got them,
Well, I mean, like we did cry it out, and
mhm,
I was like, "This is hard, but I don't know anything else to do."
right. Mhm,
Um, Even with the internet, I just don't. Let me just stop myself for a second and say the only way, I have said this all along, I will say it again until I die. The only way that people have more than one kid is that they forget about things that happened along the way. Like as
mhm,
soon as your baby is out of your body, you forget about how awful or how hard labor was. As soon
mhm.
as you get through each phase, you forget about the challenges of that one and remember the good parts. And then you're like, I could do that again. That was not so bad. That
I
I'm fully convinced that that's
I
how
tell
we
this
raise
story
more kids.
all the time, and I can't actually remember if I've told it on the podcast before, but Kara. And
Hmm.
Kara's on her second kid. And she looked at me and she goes, she hates the car so much. She just cries the whole time. My older kid never did this. And I looked at her and I was like, yes, she did. Like, yeah, you pulled over on the side of the road to breastfeed all the time. She cried constantly in the car. You were late places because, like, you stopped. Like, she cried all the time in the car seat. You just can't remember. And she was
See?
just like, really?
And she's being completely honest. She does
Yes.
not remember.
So you think Cole was easygoing? He wasn't. You just can't remember.
Maybe that's it too. Yeah. I don't know. My husband has a different memory of a lot of things in this, but like we had a conversation the other night about the sleep training that was like what worked for him is not working for her. She's just
Mm,
not responding the same way.
mhm,
And it was, I know they are different kids, but
mhm,
in my mind, I really was thinking before she was born, like part of me fully expected it to be exactly the same experience.
mhm.
And it's been completely opposite from that.
And this is like such good evidence that when experts on the internet tell you a process to follow or how something is going to go, like, yes, of course, they're experts and they have like a lot of exposure to like a large volume of kids. And so they can give you like the most universal. But when you do something exactly as you're told, quote unquote, told by an expert to do it, you're not necessarily going to get the same results. Like
Yeah.
every kid is different.
Yeah. That
And
is,
it's so frustrating, right? Because
it's
you're
so
like, I must be
frustrating.
crazy. I must be crazy. Like my kid is broken, or I'm doing it wrong, or this thing just doesn't work. And it's like, well, what if it's both and? Like, what if, yeah, you're new and maybe you're not doing it exactly like the expert is? And what if, yeah, like your kid's not broken, but your kid is different than the average? And yeah, like their thing isn't going to work for everybody. They're all true. And also, that's like not a problem.
Yeah, but the not being a problem is the hardest part
Yeah.
to accept.
So let's talk a little bit about your first pregnancy and how, I guess we can lump together your first pregnancy and birth and how that compared to your second pregnancy and birth.
Sure. So my pregnancies were actually really similar in terms of how I felt throughout it and the, I was about to call it side effects.
Symptoms?
Yes. And the symptoms that I experienced. Like, I don't really give much, you know, I don't put much value in all of the old wives' tales about like, oh, well, you're carrying low, so it's this, or, all the things they say about your hair is kind of kinky, so you're going to have a girl or you're going to have a boy, any of that stuff. But I was like convinced that my second was going to be a boy because I felt exactly the same. And turns out no.
Wait, did you not know that while you were pregnant?
No, we found out early on, but
that's what I thought.
At least for the first trimester.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I was very fortunate that I felt really good throughout both of them. For the first one, I think I got lucky. For the second one, I credit working with you and like staying as active as I could and taking care of myself while I had the time and where I had the time to do it, given everything else that was going on. My biggest things were SPD, which we can definitely come back to, and varicose veins and swelling in one leg, just one leg, because pregnancy is great. And I also, I would lose my hearing, like yeah, which is apparently a completely normal symptom of pregnancy, at least according to the What to Expect book, which I read when I was pregnant with Cole, like 3 months too late, and it was listed as one of the things that was a common.
I've never heard that. Holy cow.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like, when you're on a plane and your ears pop and you can unpop them.
It makes sense. Pressure, swelling, like
it's that, but you can't unpop it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if it was one at a time, it was fine, but occasionally it would be both. And in meetings, that's hard. So that was like my weirdest thing, which I had never heard of beforehand. All the other stuff had kind of like come into my field of view at one point or another. My births, though, were quite different. So I was full term for both of them. Cole was born at 41 weeks. Daphne was born right at 40 weeks. And with my first, I was actually scheduled to be induced because the tech that I had seen at my last prenatal appointment said that my fluids were low. It's not completely subjective, but
it's largely subjective and can depend on how the measure is taken. Right. So like you could like dance around, like sit back down, do it again, and like get a different result.
Yeah. So I say that for that reason, that anybody who's hearing this and has somebody say something like that, another person could do it, or you could get up and dance around and it would be completely different. What ended up happening for me was that they said my fluid was low. And so they were like, we're going to move up your induction date. In the end, I started having contractions the night that I was scheduled to go in for the induction. So by the time I got there, I was having contractions and they didn't end up inducing me. But a long time later, what was it? It was like a 16-hour labor ultimately, which I know is not long in the grand scheme of things. My gynecologist, who was, one in a big practice who I had met one other time prior to this,
Oh man.
um, she was like, listen, the baby's heart rate is going down when you're pushing, and
Oh, so
this
you
is,
actually reached pushing before
oh yeah,
this.
hmm
Hmm.
yeah. Um, both of them were born vaginally, got them out, but with him we ended up using, it was a forceps birth.
Mm.
And when I agreed to that, uh, it was, listen, we can try this, or we can go in and do a C-section. And I was really frightened by that, and was like, also, I have come this far. I don't
Mhm.
want to be recovering from both.
Right.
So we're going to get this baby out right now. But I really didn't know what I was getting into with a forceps birth.
Mhm.
Um, even still, like, I haven't looked it up.
Yeah, so
My husband
just
only told me, like, when right after Daphne was born, and it was I can tell you about that one too, but he only told me right after that what he saw going on, because I wasn't looking, and it would explain why, I had to have the number of stitches that I had to have, why that
right.
recovery part, and
S-
none of it was explained to me by
So
any of the
just
professionals.
for reference for anyone who's listening in is like forceps, run this by me. Um there there reaches a point in toward the end of labor that like the baby is far enough that they'll say like, okay, we can use an instrument to help this baby get the rest of the way out, as opposed to reversing them back out the tunnel, for a
That's a good way to
c-section.
put it.
And so forceps are they kind of look like salad tongs, um, and they basically grasp onto the baby's head and draw them out. They can maneuver a little bit. Some of the risks include either significant tearing, or sometimes they will cut an episiotomy in order to be able to get the forceps around the baby and get the baby out. Obviously, your body isn't, for whatever reason, your body is not opening to allow that baby out. And when you move quickly through that last bit of stretch, usually tearing is more significant. And then, of course, you add the fact that there's an instrument involved, there's a much higher chance of tearing. There can be nerve damage or trauma to the baby. So it's not super common, but it does happen that the baby can be injured in this process. And of course, all of those risks, this is why it's very helpful to know about these things beforehand, um, to have discussed them with your provider and to understand the pros and cons, is because there are risks, and there's also risks of not getting the baby out, right?
Mhm.
So you have to be able to, you know, when you're in labor, particularly in the pushing stage at the end of labor, you're not really in like a good, reasonable state to have a logical conversation.
And you won't be given the time to.
Right, right. They're going to say, this is an emergency. We need to do this right now. And you haven't. So it is helpful to understand, one, and these numbers should be available to you, what the rate of instrumental delivery is, where you're delivering, and with the practice that you're delivering, and preferably with each provider. But obviously, if you're at a large practice, you might not have a choice of which provider you're seeing. An instrumental can also mean vacuum extractor, which maybe we'll have someone who's had one of those to talk about that. But that you can talk about those risks ahead of time. I think nationally, forceps births are pretty low, like 2 to 3%, something like that. But it varies a lot regionally and by the hospital, um, and by the provider. And those things will all have an influence on the likelihood that you're going to be offered that or encouraged to take that intervention. So
Mhm.
back to your regularly scheduled programming.
No, thank you for adding that context, because it's definitely important. I don't know. Like I said, I still haven't looked it up. My husband said to me, he was like, "Did you see it?" I was like, "I did not see it. I did not see the forceps. I was literally picturing salad tongs like you
Mhm.
described it. And I guess it's like a little bit bigger and a little more, surgical looking."
Rugged. Yeah.
Yes. So it was a surprise to me to have that question put to me in that moment, where I was like, things are moving along, we're gonna do this. And then just really fearful about having to go in for a C-section ultimately. So I wouldn't have changed my choice,
Mhm.
but I do wish that, and upon reflecting, I wish that I had thought differently about my response.
Mhm.
You have, I can't remember which class it is, but there's a class with 3 questions, like,
Mhm.
is mom okay? Is baby okay? Can we have more time?
Mhm.
And I wish that in that moment I had been thinking about that.
Mhm. Or
And
your partner or your doula if you have a doula. Like all
right,
of these people are in a little bit better state of mind to ask those questions.
you definitely.
And so I will just like reiterate that for anyone who's listening who's pregnant right now, you always can ask those questions, right? Your provider is not, hopefully, your provider is not going to lie to you and tell you that you are in danger that you are not in danger of. And one of my teachers always says, you can always ask to pray. You don't have to pray, but you can say like, can we take a moment to pray before making this decision? And if the answer is yes, you can take a moment to pray, then you're not going to like then obviously it is not emergent enough that they need you to make a decision immediately. And sometimes getting people to take a step back or clear the room may allow things to progress in a way that they weren't able to when while you were being crowded and things were beeping and people were telling you that your baby's in trouble and all of those things.
Right. That's an interesting technique.
Yeah,
A
and I said this
strategy.
also in the episode with Brittany about HELP syndrome. If there is an emergency, like a real true emergency, it's going to be really clear. Like the conversation changes when you or your child is in imminent risk of death. So as long as people are still, talking to you and explaining things and, you can say, am I okay? Is the baby okay? Can we take a few minutes?
Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah, go ahead.
for any person who is having a baby, the other thing that I didn't expect in that scenario was, because the option of a C-section was formally put on the table, the room then filled with
Mm,
so many people who would be involved in that process if
mhm.
I had elected that initially, or the forceps didn't work and we were forced to move to a C-section. So there were like, again, my husband calls this much better than I do.
Blessedly, he remembers it better than you do.
Yeah. But it was the anesthesiologist. There are
Mhm,
all kinds of residents and interns, nurses, the
mhm,
pediatrician. Like, labor and delivery rooms are not super large, and there were
mhm.
at least 10 people,
Right.
not
And
not including the nurse who is next to me, my doctor, and um, it certainly wasn't a medical student, but she was definitely like showing the procedure to
mm,
somebody who was learning how to use forceps at the same time. So yeah,
and I'm assuming that at no point did anyone gain your consent for all of those people entering your space.
she, I
I mean,
definitely did
the
say it was
the
okay to
student,
have,
I'm sure
yeah,
they asked you. They have to ask for a
yeah.
student. They
And
don't
I'm
always
using the word student, but I really, I don't mean somebody in medical school.
resident, yeah,
Yeah,
whatever. Or uh oh my God.
intern, whatever
Yes.
they're
Yeah.
called at that point. Yeah.
Um, but they really, I mean, again, and I have a whole episode coming out about doulas and what they do and all of that, but like this is a place where either a really well-informed partner or a doula can be super helpful just to say, hey, the birthing person does not want these people in the room. Please wait in the hallway. If, if you're needed for a C-section, we'll let you know. But we need more space, etc. They, again, I don't expect partners who are having their first or second child to like necessarily have all of the information and the like wherewithal to be like, my partner does not feel
Right.
that like
Right. And
they
the
don't.
confidence to do that.
Yeah, they're also in an emotionally heightened state. This is their kid and their partner. Like they're also not necessarily in the most logical, reasonable, and they may have been up for a long, long time too.
Yes.
And just to like give the partners a
Sorry.
little bit of credit, no worries, you're fine. To give the partners a little bit of credit, when you're birthing, you're getting these hormones that keep you awake and allow you to do that work. Your partner is not. So your partner is just running on adrenaline that they're like, and Red Bull and forcing themselves to stay awake through this. So if you do have a really long labor, they might not necessarily be in a great position to advocate for you.
Yeah. It didn't even occur to me or to him in that moment. And we did not have a doula to say like, can some of these people leave? I mean, yeah. Anyway, so that's all. That was the first. Oh, the only other thing I want to say about this is my looking back on it, like I feel very strongly that I was not adequately informed about what had happened to me and therefore what my recovery was really going to look like. And I didn't ask any questions because nobody said, hey, listen, here's what happened. I just assumed that everything was completely normal. Yes, I had the forceps, but it wasn't like, okay, that means that there, aside from you had some internal bleeding, you have stitches, you have internal stitches and some external stitches. There was no episiotomy, so it wasn't that. But that was like the extent of it. And the reality for me was that I couldn't walk my dog around the block for at least a month, 6 weeks. I could barely sit down, and that was it was a mix of the actual like vaginal damage, but then a really awesome hemorrhoid or hemorrhoids, who knows. I wasn't looking. And I didn't have what I needed at home to make myself feel comfortable, and I didn't know that I needed it.
Oh my God. These stories are, first of all, are why we're doing this series, because you don't know what you don't know. And of course, I would love if we have so many parents on that we've covered every possible variation and every possible complication. But also, like, I think the theme that keeps coming up is like, unfortunately, like, one, yes, let's work to change the status quo and to make things better so that you're not, having to push for yourself so much and having to, advocate to get the information you need. But also, until we change the system, you have to, like, you get to ask infinity questions of your provider. You get to ask them before the baby, like you get to ask them at week 10, you get to ask them at week 40, you get to keep asking all of the questions so that you are 100% sure where you stand going into labor. And then postpartum, you also get to ask all the questions. Like, they have people who work at the hospital whose job is just to discharge you. And like, you could just sit there and be like, I had a forceps birth. I don't understand what that means. Can you explain to me what these stitches are, and how is that going to heal, and what can I do to help? And is there anything else I can do to alleviate discomfort? And how do I know when I should call the doctor? Like, how much pain is normal? How many pain relievers should I be taking? Is that a concern with breast? Like, you could ask all the questions, all of them, and write them down. You can, like,
oh my gosh, write them down.
with someone's consent, you can do an audio recording and or write them down, and if possible, have your partner present.
Yes. because there's no way. I mean, even as I came up with things, I would forget them immediately. Or like by the time somebody finally came into the room,
Mm-hmm.
you're like, oh, I forgot what I wanted to ask you about.
Yeah. So with all of that stitching and all of that, how long were you in the hospital before you were discharged?
Standard 2 nights.
Yep. Okay, so tell us about
Yep.
round two.
Round 2 was same pregnancy. Everything accelerated in terms of the timeline with which I
Which is normal.
experienced
People
those.
get
Yeah.
quote bigger. You tend to like show sooner and all of that just because your muscles are like, we know what we're doing. You want us to allow some space, huh?
Yes. Yes, exactly. So everything was like ramped up a little bit in terms of the timeline, but otherwise the same. And then with my daughter, I signed off on my last day of work before my maternity leave. It happened to be a Friday afternoon. I had seen my doctor that morning at 9 a.m. and they said, this baby's not going anywhere. And then at 8 p.m. that night, my water broke. So
You had no labor before your water broke.
none. And my water was broken at the hospital the first time. So I was just sitting on the couch watching a movie and then like felt myself sitting in a puddle. And
This happens to my 2-year-old all the time too.
honestly, I did think that for a second. Yeah. And even with this one, I had tested positive for group strep B. And because my water broke and I had tested positive for that, when I called my provider to say, hey, my water broke, they said, you have to go to the hospital.
Yeah. So just so anyone who wants to know, group strep B does not mean she had strep throat. It's just a bacteria that can be present around the vagina. You typically get tested for it toward the end of pregnancy. If you have it, this used to be like a huge risk. If you have it now, they generally just want you to labor at the hospital so that they can administer antibiotics. And just because, obviously the baby's passing through, so the baby gets covered in it, you have it present, you have tearing and all of this, stuff in potentially getting into your bloodstream. So they just want to give you antibiotics. And if your water has broken, that means that there's no longer like a protective plastic baggie around the baby. And so that group strep B can travel up the vaginal canal and into the amniotic fluid, or pardon me, not into the amniotic fluid, into the uterus where the baby is chilling. So they want you to have the baby pretty quickly, and they want to give you both antibiotics if you are tested positive.
Yes to both of those things. Perfect explanation as far as I understood it. So we went to the hospital and I did my labor at the hospital.
And they still allowed you to labor naturally. So you eventually started having contractions on your own.
Yeah, I started having contractions on my own pretty quickly after my water broke. But when we got to the hospital, everyone was like, oh, it's your second baby. This is going to be like half the time of your first. And it wasn't quite half, but it was more than half. I think Cole was 16 hours. She was closer to 12. So it took a little bit longer than they would have liked. And there again was the question of, are we going to start Pitocin, which would be the hormone that would speed up the labor, speed up the contractions. In the end, they didn't do that. So I was able to labor on my own, and she was so low starting out that by the time we actually got to the pushing phase, it was
she was like there.
Truly, she was just there. It was this time it was just me, my husband, one labor and delivery nurse, and my doctor, who happened to be a different provider from the same practice. And I mean, honestly, if the four of us could have been twiddling our thumbs waiting for a contraction to come, we should have. It was the complete opposite of the first time, where it was so uneventful, it was almost boring, like waiting to be able to push. Like I can't even I can't say how boring it was. It was like, All right. Well,
So some people actually have reported like basically falling asleep between contractions in the pushing stage, because in pushing your contractions space back out. And sometimes they space way
way
out.
back out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I ultimately, so we did a practice push and she was like, my doctor was like, okay, stop, stop, stop. Because that's how low the baby's head was already. And so with this one, I just pushed once, she was out, and that was it. And it was like just the complete opposite. So, you know, I had braced myself for the worst. I was expecting to have to go through the same thing again. And, thinking about, okay, now we have a 3-year-old and a new baby, and I'm not going to be able to walk again for another month.
Right.
So
you had like no trauma to the pelvic floor or to the tissue.
None at all. No stitches, no nothing.
Amazing.
It was just over. And I, partially because of COVID, but not partially because of COVID, they're discharging people early when they can. So instead of staying 2 nights, we only stayed 1 night. And honestly, I felt so fine afterwards. I was like, do we even have to stay this night? Ultimately, it was a good thing that we did.
Well, was the night you stayed the night you were in labor?
Yes.
Well, okay, so
she was born in the
probably.
morning. She was born in the morning, so we at 8 a.m. So we stayed that night.
Oh, okay.
And discharged the next day.
Okay.
But by like 8 p.m., I was like, we could go.
I mean,
I peed on my own now. I could shower.
Yeah, people are often very shocked. Like our local birth center, because they only have 2 birthing rooms, they discharge you 3 to 4 hours later.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, your partner you get in the car, you strap that baby into a car seat, and you drive home.
The first time that would have freaked me out to be like, I'm not sure, especially in only 3 to 4 hours. Am I really supposed to take this baby home by myself?
Well, it is worth noting that like if it's a birth center birth, like you've had very minimal, like you haven't had any drugs. You've had very minimal. And so you're not like recovering from an epidural, like trying to walk again.
Right.
You're essentially, I mean, you're probably like lightheaded because you've lost a lot of blood. And of course they do keep you if you've had any postpartum complications or any issues with the placenta or anything like that. But in general, yeah, they kick you right out.
Well, that I would have been up for this time around.
Yeah. You're like, I would like a snack. I'd like to go to my house and get in my bed.
Yeah, we were so lucky because, obviously no family this time around. And with the first one, my dad, I joke about this, but family outside of your partner or whoever is like in the delivery room with you, like no family is allowed on the labor and delivery floor. Like in the maternity ward, people can come visit you. My dad broke into the labor and delivery room twice.
That's amazing.
He just could not stop himself. He got to the hospital so early in the morning, and then it was just like he couldn't wait. I was like, you can't be here. Please.
Wait, this was for Cole. This was first time around because he couldn't come at all the second time.
Exactly. So the second time I am saying we got so lucky because we had friends who lived near the hospital and they brought us tacos for dinner. And I was like, this is the best thing ever. So.
Amazing. Yeah. So we're like, I want to really quickly, because you mentioned it earlier, I want to really quickly just describe what SPD is and have you tell us like what things most helped with that. So do you want to describe SPD?
I can describe SPD in a non-clinical, informative way.
I think that's the best kind of explanation. As long as you're not wrong, I won't correct you.
So SPD, which stands for, what is that?
Drum roll. It's symphysis pubis, and then actually the acronym is different. Different people say symphysis pubis diastasis or symphysis pubis disorder or dysfunction.
Yeah, so just like everything else, it's a disorder. Not a completely normal occurrence because your body is making room to be able to grow this baby and then get it out of you. So your hip bones, your pelvis, the tissue that holds it together in the front is going to get all loosey-goosey so that you can push a baby out of you. And when that happens and your bones are no longer like aligned in the way that they either used to be or should be, because I'm sure that some people are not perfectly aligned to begin with, but anyway, you get all loosey-goosey, and when you're not even like that, it causes excruciating pain.
I describe it as like if you've accidentally walked into the, by the way, the comedian Eliza Schlesinger has a whole bit about this, but if you've accidentally walked into like a corner or a post, like on your crotch, that feeling, if you like accidentally walk your pubic bone into something painfully.
I can picture it. Like I can feel it, but I don't know if I had ever done that beforehand.
Oh my God. I was going to say, you've never lived. Like, no, I have for sure like accidentally walked into something that's like, you know, like right at hip height, like pubic bone first. There's a lot of nerves there, right? Like we're real close to your sex organs. Like there's a lot of nerve endings. And I'm not talking about like vaginally, I'm talking about like in the front, your actual pubic bone, it is very sensitive to pressure.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, SPD, it's like spreading or torquing a little bit side to side. And that's super painful. So if anyone has really intense pubic or even mild pubic bone pain, a lot of the time it's irritated by standing on one leg or like squatting deeply. What are some of the things, like give us 2 or 3 things that most helped get you out of the acute pain and like keep it from coming back?
Well, so the first time around, because I wasn't working with you then, when I brought it up to my doctor, they were like, sorry, there's nothing we can do really. And right. The answer was you can walk with a cane. You could go to occupational therapy, which, you know, when it's like listed like that, it's like, well, I don't want to do any of those things. I don't think I need that. And it wasn't so severe that I felt like I needed to, you know, have some assistance walking. It was just super painful to do it. So now I know that there's plenty of different stretches and exercises and ways to be, you know, just cautious with your body and still do some of the things that you're used to doing.
Right. And
So,
you were running prior to having the SPD the first time.
I was running when it started. I went for a run with my husband, who is not a runner. And so when he was like, let's go for a run, I was like, yes, let's do it. And halfway through it, I was like, I can't walk. And I was at like somewhere between 20 and 25 weeks. I can't remember exactly. And for me, it went away. The first time it just kind of went away after a couple of weeks. I didn't do anything about it. The second time with you, you know, we worked through, you know, doing stretches, not going so far down into them, doing things more parallel instead of turned out. You know, just, I mean, for me, I think doing things more parallel and just like knowing that I didn't have to do a full stretch the way that I was used to doing a full stretch, like in a lunge or something like that, really was better. You know,
right. And you said you're a yogi, so like you're bendy, like you're used to going deep into these things.
Yeah. And so for me, having to do like a 90 degree bends in both knees instead of a lunge, it was, the old me would have said like, well, this isn't right. You know, this isn't a real stretch. And now I'm like, not only can I still feel a real stretch because I know how to do it, but I know that I'm not hurting myself more.
Yeah. And that, I mean, ultimately everyone gets to choose, right? Everyone gets to choose whether they would rather like satisfy their ego or avoid pain. And often those choices are different between the first and second pregnancy. But I also want to mention quickly that SPD, if it happens in a first pregnancy, to my knowledge, it almost always happens in subsequent pregnancies, and it can happen postpartum as well. So things that help, obviously appropriately modifying your movement and not moving. So not moving can like exacerbate the underlying postural habits that are causing the pelvis to spread in that way. So if you've had it before and you're pregnant now, start early with corrective exercises before you have pain.
Yes.
And
And be very aware of when you do start to feel
Mhm.
the slightest bit of something.
Mhm.
So you
Yeah.
don't have to get to.
If you've had it before, you know what you're looking for.
Exactly.
So
You don't have to walk into a post.
yeah, no, oh my God. Oh God, it's like so cringy.
You can feel it right now. I know.
I can. Yeah, and pelvic floor PT is available if you have a provider who's willing to refer you to pelvic floor PT. Some providers are just like not super informed and they're just like, this is just how it is. If they're willing to, and OT as well, if they're willing to refer out, that means that assuming you are insured, you're going to get some level of coverage. Almost certainly you can talk to the providers and talk to your insurance and make sure that it's going to be affordable for you. But if you can get a referral, it is usually cheaper than paying out of pocket, and it does help. If you can't get a referral or you don't want to do pelvic floor PT for any number of reasons, there are very simple adjustments that you can make, and they all kind of require dropping the ego.
Yes.
This has been so helpful, Joanna. I really, really appreciate you taking the time and being generous with your vulnerability, because now you're assigned to listen to Brene Brown. So thank you for being vulnerable and sharing your story. Every time we, come forward and share our story, we empower the next person following behind us to know what is and isn't normal and what options are available to them. So it really is incredibly beneficial.
Well, I'm happy to do it. And, there are certain things that I'm like, I do understand why nobody talks about this, right? About this particular thing. But
Yeah.
all the other stuff that we talked about today don't fall into that category. It's good to be informed.
It is so good to be informed. It's really, knowledge is power.
And I mean, it sounds lame, but it's true.
It's true. All right. Thanks so
Thank you
much.
for having me.